Hello, and welcome to Part 6 of the Praxist Table Talk analysis of Julius Evola's Revolt Against the Modern World. My name is Vincent, I'm the founder of Praxia, and with me I have a very important member of our Leadership Council. Cody, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Hello, everyone.
Glad to hear that. How was your Thanksgiving? This is the episode right after Thanksgiving, so just to catch up, not to date the episode or anything, but I hope you did well.
It was cold and lonely.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm very sorry to hear that.
No, it's no worries. It was quite peaceful.
This episode, we are going to be touching upon the chapters which are named, we're going to be dealing with chapters 16, 17, and 18. And so 16 will be, Bipartition of the Traditional Spirit, Asceticism. And 17 is the Greater and the Lesser Holy War. And 18 is Games and Victory. And the three chapters we went over last time were the Soul of Chivalry, the Doctrine of the Castes, and Professional Associations in the Arts, Slavery. And I think that those chapters lead very nicely into these ones, with these kind of carrying on the points which are emphasized in those chapters. So the first chapter we'll be bringing up today covers the idea of asceticism and what that truly means in the traditional sense, along with some examples. And the next one continues an idea that was brought up in the Soul of Chivalry chapter, which we'll get into as it comes, but I think it's another representation of that dichotomy between the greater and lesser forms of being, relating that to war. And it's a very interesting chapter. The one after that is Games and Victory, which very nicely carries on that idea of a warrior spirit, I think. That chapter essentially carries on the idea that is brought up in the chapter before it. So each of these chapters flow very, very nicely into each other. I think that chapter to the chapter before it is what Professional Associations was to the Doctrine of the Castes. It's a reinterpretation of the same principles and detailing its secondary manifestations. Not necessarily lesser, but secondary. And so those are the chapters that we're going to be dealing with today. They all carry on the same central theme, which is that idea of asceticism, which we'll be touching upon with chapter 1. But they each detail a different important aspect of what asceticism looks like in the face of both a contemplatory path, or more so like a peacetime path, and then the warrior path, or the path of action, and then what that path of action looks like in peacetime, if that makes sense. And so each of these three, I think, generally blend together, and so we're gonna have we got a pretty easy episode on our hands. What were your thoughts, Cody, when you went into this?
I thought that it was quite ironic that 16, being one of the shorter chapters in the book that we've covered so far, had such a dense explanation of, these concepts, setting up 17 and 18 for, the further examples they bring in that peacetime and wartime mentality of the ascetic. And then 17 and 18 were quite long, but could be shortened down in much more terse terms. So I thought it was funny that Evola could be flexible in saying a lot with a little, and then giving too much or saying too much without really saying much of anything. But even still, the point gets across that there are very necessary roles in both the combat and battle of our world, and the heroic and victorious pursuit in another plane, that both work towards this ascetic vision that transcends the caste system and is this intermediary between the divine and the initiated, which many people either skip or don't seem to understand in many aspects, and we'll get to that as well.
Yeah. So, you ready to just jump right into chapter 16?
Absolutely. Take it away.
All right. So, chapter 16 is called Bipartition of the Traditional Spirit and Asceticism. And this bipartition that he talks about, it is the necessary split between the two different ascetic paths that you could find in the traditional world. So he starts out by saying, having explained the spirit that animated the caste system, it is now necessary to discuss the path that is above the castes and directed at implementing the realization of transcendence, in analogous terms to those of high initiation, yet outside the specific and rigorous structures characterizing it. On the one hand, the pariah, he says it, never mind. On the one hand, the pariah is a person without a caste, one who has lapsed or who has eluded the form by being, powerless before it, thus returning to the infernal world. The ascetic, on the other hand, is a being above the caste, one who becomes free from the form by renouncing the illusory center of human individuality. He turns towards the principle from which every form proceeds, not by faithfulness to his own nature, and by participation in the hierarchy, but by a direct action. Therefore, as great as was the revulsion harbored by every caste towards the pariah in Aryan India, so by contrast was the veneration felt by everybody for a person who was above the castes. These beings, according to a Buddhist image, should not be expected to follow a human dharma, just as one who's trying to kindle a fire ultimately does not care what kind of wood is being employed, as long as it's capable of producing fire and light. So he starts off the chapter by saying that, and so that's kind of the essential theme that's going to be carried on throughout these two chapters, and this kind of it marks a correlation between a few things that I've been bringing up recently, in other circles and conversations that I've been having, is that there's two different paths, I feel like, to participation in what we would call the quintessential reality. And so the quintessential reality, that's what we consider the domain of metaphysics, right? It's this idea of the place in which the design and the adherence to the design are one and the same thing. And then a person would be able to participate in this design by achieving the status of something that is archetypal or something to which he needs to adhere. So by essentially aligning all of those components to which he is predisposed, actively aligning those and fulfilling those in his life. And so essentially the design would become manifest in the individual or in the being itself, and that's how you essentially participate in the quintessential reality while still being part of the earth, or still being part of the worldly domain, the temporal domain. And so the what Evola here is talking about is the two paths to this type of participation. And on the one hand, you have the path of not religious righteousness, but basically traditional spirituality. I guess the word is common traditional spirituality. And then on the other hand, you have this very niche type of spirituality, which is asceticism, which is essentially outside of the domain of traditional common spirituality, but it's still a path to that type of participation in the quintessential reality. So on the one hand, you have this idea of conformity to caste. It's the conforming type, where a being necessarily has to manifest all of the qualities to which he is predisposed, and his only true worth, or its only true worth as a being, is adhering to these qualities, adhering to this design. Whereas the ascetic is more so a fluid type of being who can adhere to this design, or basically the ascetic is a fluid type of being that has no design, and so can adhere to any part within it and can understand and maneuver the design itself. And so this is a different type of path to participate in the quintessential reality by sort of identifying being external to the system and sort of maneuvering it and filling in the gaps, as it were. And so that's
to reiterate that, it's essentially having the traditional spiritual path being one within the hierarchy, as explained through the Solar Kings and the previous chapters that have explained these different aspects of society, going from the ground up, or from the center out, as it were, which we've gone over. And then this ascetic path is the one outside the hierarchy that can almost freelance their own spiritual ascension and, like Vincent said, fill in the gaps within society, or do things outside of societal norms that wouldn't have been able to be accomplished but are still welcomed anyways.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's sort of an independent participation in regality rather than a codependent participation, where on the one hand, with this normal type of spirituality, you would have to conform to your caste or conform to your certain position in a hierarchy. With the ascetic, it's much different. The ascetic is much more independent, and so instead of having to go through all of these mediums to reach that that participation, you essentially make a direct connection to the quintessential reality itself. That's the difference here, is that one, you have a connection to a hierarchy that is the vehicle that drives you to this participation, and with the ascetic path, you are actively participating in this yourself. It is through no other medium, and maybe you might be using some type of spiritual medium, but all of these are within your own power, within the power of the individual, not necessarily forces that are external to it, if that makes sense. And
the path of the ascetic is one of an exceptional person, and the traditional path that goes on for ascension in a spiritual sense, it could be argued that is much easier because there is the structure beneath it and the tradition that flows from it that's passed down and passed on, either secretly or openly, depending on what spirituality or religious sect that you're in, continues this progress as it's taught, essentially. But on the ascetic side, it is, like Vincent was saying, completely self-taught and is much more difficult, and it is for the few, the exceptional, the great man, as it were, which someone like Carlyle might say would be the men who drive history in a way.
Yeah, it's essentially, so last episode, it was funny enough, I brought up the idea of the two types of being, right? You have the superior and the lesser, or the greater and the lesser types of being. And that greater being is that, initiated archetypal being, the essential type. And then the lesser is that more substantial, non-initiated, where they conform to a sort of lower type of activity of a more temporal or relative domain. And so these two types of being, in a sense, are manifested. You could see these two types within every conception. Every conception has a superior and a lesser type, one which is sort of aligned with this quintessential reality, and then one where there is no connection between some type of metaphysical principle or archetypal principle and the thing itself. And so this even manifests when there is a direct connection in both scenarios. On the one hand, you have the lesser path of the normal tradition, and then on the other hand, you have the greater path of the ascetic. That's not to say that the normal tradition is in any way bad, but it's just of a lesser potency within the individual than asceticism is. And Evola puts it here. He says, asceticism occupies an ideal intermediary state between the plane of direct, Olympian, and initiatory regality and the plane of right and of dharma. So that's kind of the separation that we're talking about here. Is on the one hand, you have this lineage, this initiatic lineage that takes you in and bestows upon you all of the qualities, or activates within you all of the qualities necessary for you to essentially participate in this type of being. Whereas the ascetic sort of taps into a degree or a plane of reality that is above that lineage. It sort of it almost founds an individual lineage for the one person himself, and this is not something that every person has access to. It's a very select few among every given society, and so you have to be disposed to be an ascetic almost, or if you are not disposed, you have to properly follow this path. And I think this is kind of going off into the weeds here, but I feel like the mystics and such who sort of deviate from the path of regality and the path of divinity and go into, various dark, occult, and satanic stuff. I feel like this is the deviation of the path of the ascetic, or the ascetic. So many people try to follow this more individualized path and end up falling flat due to their, I guess, incomprehensibility, or to the incomprehensibility of the true ascetic path to them, if that makes sense. So they wind up participating in something lower than what the ascetic is, in some type of sub-physical or chthonic or dark force or something like that. That's kind of how I
we
see
actually
it.
we actually had that conversation off call on one of our bi-weekly calls, and it's similar to what's referred to as the rule of two, which is in similar function to what Vincent just said. And I definitely agree that it's the path that most of the elite, or those in the cathedral, however you want to say it, what they practice in their vision of asceticism.
I think
Excuse me. Which kind of formulates in a weird way into this hyper-materialistic type of transhumanist idealism. And that is what they're aiming for whatever strange reasons, that maybe they have some knowledge through this ascetic journey that they're on that, we don't, but it seems counterintuitive to have those aims and essentially defile themselves spiritually through the actions which they take to go through this process, this, Kabbalah, or these dark esoteric rituals of borderline or full-blown satanic proportions.
Yeah.
But, sorry, you were going to say?
Oh, no, I was just going to detail that same kind of conversation. And it's funny because we brought it up with the rule of two. Cody was having a conversation on another podcast about, or he was watching another podcast maybe about this idea of the rule of two, which is essentially two paths to spirituality. And this was a sort of a interpretation of what in traditional, occultism or esotericism has been called the left hand and the right hand path. And these two paths are, they're very arbitrarily defined, because depending on who you ask, you might find a different answer. You might get a different answer as to what one is. Like, some say that the left hand path is transcendence through the ugly or through the undesirable, while others might say that the left hand path just represents a more individual approach to spirituality, whereas others might say that the left hand path represents a sort of trying to overtake or become a god. But in all honesty, I feel like if you were to talk about pure concept and not any type of connotation that is bestowed upon it by some type of form of occultism, and you were to just take these two concepts right here, the path of the ascetic and then the path of the normal person, normal traditional man, I think these very much identify with the left hand and the right hand path. On the right hand, you would have that, traditional regality, participation in the hierarchy, in the caste system, in getting initiated into a certain lineage or a trade or something like that. And then on the left hand path, that would be the path of the ascetic. And I feel like when the path of the ascetic is properly completed, it is no longer considered to be the left hand path because of all of these negative connotations associated with that term. But really, that's essentially what this principle manifests, is that on the one hand, you have the traditional individual who participates in the quintessential reality through various modes that are external to him and social and incorporate many other individuals and historicity. Whereas on the other hand, you have this almost direct transcendence of an individual, and that would be the left-hand path. And the reason I think why the left-hand path has so much negative connotations to it is because so many people try to take this path and ascend upwards, and really they wind up descending downwards and losing all of their losing all of the characteristics that would allow them to participate in the archetypal if they were to have tried the other way, and instead they just become absorbed into this chthonic, identityless mass that characterizes the uninitiated and the temporal and the physical and the relative. And so that's what I think the differentiation is here. And so
that's why we say that. Oh, sorry, I thought you were done.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. I was done. I was going to say, I was going to move on to a little bit later in the chapter.
That's why we say that the left-hand path, as it were, is for the exceptional person. This path of asceticism is for the great man or the divine king, as it were, in some sense, that they have the predestination or predisposition to be able to do these things and these feats that no normal person would, and why we see that so many of those taking this left-hand path nowadays are devolving into those states of inferiority and failing, because it is, walking on the razor's edge, and most will slip and fall and cut themselves. The exceptional person does not do so because they can walk that narrow line and be able to get past the gauntlet unscathed.
Exactly.
The issue is that so many people are vying for this type of power, which, like Vincent said, is some people trying to become godlike in their own sense. And that pursuit is the corrupting factor in so much of what they're trying to achieve in the first place. So it's almost sealing their own fate, as it were. And And Evola even puts it in explaining the ascetic path with Buddhism, that the awakened one isn't, or the enlightened one, the one who reaches nirvana, is beyond that of even a god, where gods are powers that need to be liberated or enlightened themselves, and they have their own paths to go down. So man or god or whatever ethereal or physical being that can put themselves on an ascetic path and achieve it is something that truly transcends our reality as we know it. And that is something that is so exceedingly rare to ever accomplish. And I don't think anyone could point to an instance where that happens, because you wouldn't really know. You wouldn't know how to identify it. It could be staring you in the face, and it would go over the average person's head, probably our heads as well.
Because it's incomprehensible, yeah.
Unless you are right there with it.
Exactly. And so that's why, so what Evola's talking about here is this left-hand path, not with the black magic or satanic connotations that are usually imposed onto it, but in this pure sense of divide between left and right. Evola's talking about this left-hand path in the traditional sense, and he's talking about when this path manifests correctly and when the correct type of individual partakes in this path and assumes the discipline that is necessary to become an ascetic and actually practices and participates within the higher mode of being. And so essentially that's what he's talking about here with tapping into that higher plane here of the plane between, plane of direct Olympian the intermediary state between the plane of direct Olympian and initiatory reality and the plane of right and dharma. It's that tiny little bit right there. It kind of draws from both. And he says, asceticism also presents two features or qualifications that from a broader perspective may be considered as qualifications of the same traditional spirit. The first aspect of the ascetic path is action, understood as heroic action. The second aspect in asceticism is in the technical sense of the word, especially with reference to the path of contemplation. Beyond complete traditional forms, and in more recent times, some civilizations have arisen that were inspired in different degrees by either one of these two poles. Later on, we shall see that the role the two aspects have played in the dynamism of historic forces, even on the plane that is related to the ethnic and racial factor. So, he's basically saying that in the truest sense of asceticism, you will have this sort of unity between divine action and divine contemplation. So that it's these, and it's funny because it's a manifestation of the divide between essence and substance, or potential and actual. All of these, you have this sort of divide, or quiddity and existence, whatever, however you want to divide these things. This is exactly the same type of divide you will find in the path of asceticism. Is there is two aspects. If you want one holistic type of asceticism, you will have both action and contemplation. But if you want to take asceticism and divide it into its two key modes, you have to follow either the contemplatory or the actionable path. And so in throughout history, many civilizations have risen where they have either at their forefront the path of action and the path of contemplation. And again, he says he's going to outline this later, and he does. He goes on. The whole second half of the book is about sort of a historiography of tradition and how tradition has developed over the past, recorded history and even prehistory. He gets into things like Hyperborea and all that stuff. The second part of this book is very interesting.
Even starts to bring that up now in chapter 17 and 18, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, but in a sense, you can take a look at the different traditions that have arisen even in our timeline and pinpoint which of these traditions have at their center one of these two paths of asceticism. And sometimes you can even identify both forms in the same tradition, but one takes a greater precedence or is emphasized more in that tradition over the other. So for example, in let's say in Christianity, you will see the path of the contemplator be way more prominent than the path of the warrior, which was kind of subdued after the Templar rule, or the Templar fiasco that we talked about in the last episode. Or was it the last episode? Whatever episode we talked about it in. I'm getting lost here, but that was essentially Christianity was split, in the Middle Ages between these two types of asceticism, these two paths to spirituality, and you could see that the contemplatory or passive or essential aspect took a greater precedence over the active warrior, substantial type of spirituality. And when this happens, you see a sort of suppression of one over the other, where the warrior aspect is now suppressed in modern Christianity to a very extreme extent. And if you want to contrast that with another type of spirituality, you can look at the Nordic spirituality, where they had a very strong warrior element. And while they did have people like, the mystics and the shamans and the seers and all of that stuff, the contemplatory path wasn't as greatly emphasized in the Nordic tradition. And you can just tell that by the lack of evidence that they have, the lack of writings and all of that existed for other religions who embraced the ascetic or the contemplatory path a bit more. So you can contrast these two different traditions, and you can find the same elements, the same type of spirituality, the same participation in some type of divinity, but manifesting very, very differently. And a few traditions that I think actually managed to keep this asceticism whole and pure and sort of have different outlets for these two different modes of participating in asceticism are Islam and previously I would say the Greek tradition. And I think the Greek tradition did this well because they were sort of, divided up into their own little clans, and you can't really say that there was one definitive Greek tradition. There's just a sort of broad overlap of these various traditions together. And Hindu is very much the same way. But if you want to look at strictly the West or the Western world, Islam and the Greek traditions are two key examples that we can be familiar with that I think keep this type of asceticism pure. And we can see that from the works of Islamic scholars who take the works of Plato and translate them into Islam. Or you can see these, you can see the works of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, or all of the Greek philosophers themselves who have these myths about both completing some type of feat in an action sense, and then also they have this cultural emphasis on knowledge and recording down all of their knowledge and contemplating the stars and the heavens and all of that. They have the what are they called, like the heavenly bodies? The word is escaping me, but you know what I mean. They have the like the zodiac and all of that type of stuff. So it's all they keep this path, or they keep these aspects to their spirituality very well intact, I think. And but when civilizations rise up which have one or the other in favor of, when there's an unequal balance, that's where you start to see problems. And so that's what Evola gets into later. But as he goes,
and on that point, which, by the way, were you thinking of astrology before?
Yeah, astrology. Yeah, that's what it was.
Okay. On that point too, is kind of calls back to one of the far back in the previous chapters on polar symbolism and that concept of the Cakravartin, or the divine king, that is able to balance both of these types of ascetic paths, or was ascetic themselves through one of these paths, but could balance one with the other once they, have that right that they've gained, that RITE, right, and transcended this caste or this aspect of society in which they now rule over, because they have the wisdom and power and prowess and virility, as Evola always brings up, to be able to contemplate and then take action on whichever of these
modes
forms need to be applied. And that's what we kind of get to more now in these paths, where you have this polar symbology there, or this polar dichotomy that is brought back up again in this chapter.
Yeah, and it does really classify, or it does really embody the idea of the act potency distinction too, because to have an action, it has to have had a potency, and there are numerous potentials that can be actualized. And so the contemplatory path kind of represents that potential aspect, where you can contemplate the things that have happened or need to happen, and then with the path of action is obviously self-explanatory. You just take action on what you have contemplated, whether it be, some type of warrior type of action that you need to participate in, or whether it be some type of social function that you need to enact, or some type of initiation that you need to transpose onto someone else. Whether it be anything like that, the path of action,
even just to take action, not to be idle, because as we've gone over in previous chapters as well, idleness is the thing that is probably considered most, how would you say,
most destructive,
hated,
most damaging
in a way.
Yeah.
That would be on par of being a pariah, as much as someone, rebelling against the caste or trying to exist outside the caste system who isn't ascetic themselves. It's always looked on as, idleness is a destructive or deteriorative force, idle hands are the devil's playthings type of deal.
Yeah. And so keep in mind also that these two aspects of asceticism, they are not just limited to asceticism. They are aspects that you can find around you in all types of spirituality, but they characterize the path of the ascetic so much because they need to have this type of balance within the person who practices them. Or at least the person who practices asceticism needs to have a mastery over one of the two, if not both, to properly transcend and participate in this higher form of being. And so he says later on, action and knowledge are two fundamental human faculties. In both domains, it is possible to accomplish an integration capable of removing human limitations. The asceticism of contemplation consists of the integration of the knowing faculty, achieved through the detachment from sensible reality, with the neutralization of individual rationalizing faculties, and with the progressive stripping of the nucleus of consciousness, which thus becomes free from conditionings and subtracts itself from the limitation and from the necessity of any determination, whether real or virtual. Now, that was kind of a mouthful, but essentially what he's saying is that it takes the integration of the knowing faculty, which is like your sort of mind, your perception, whatever it is that you know things with, and the integration of that with the neutralization of individual rationalizing faculties. So you're not trying to rationalize this type of behavior, this type of path of asceticism. You're trying to contemplate, and whether it is rational or not, you still need to understand it and know it. So it's essentially not compartmentalizing what it is that you're contemplating, but essentially grasping the holistic idea outside of any type of compartmentalizing. Because, humans very much like to categorize things that they see. And so that's why I think like Evola and Ganon kind of take a nosedive when it comes to like things like the caste system, because they heavily categorize things that are in castes, whereas in reality these things are much less distinct than the human mind perceives them to be. Their quiddity is only perceived in the human mind, and whereas being is this one holistic thing. And so when you contemplate being, or when you contemplate the pure nature of reality, you are contemplating that which is, and you are contemplating all of that, or all of the forms that which is takes, in a sense. So you're not dividing them, you're not rationalizing them, you're not compartmentalizing them, you are taking it in and essentially letting yourself exist within it, or understanding the nature of it. And so essentially that's how your consciousness becomes free from conditionings, because you're not conditioning yourself to any of these categorizations or these relative factors, the infinite relations of everything to every other thing. And you are subtracting itself from the limitation and from the necessity of any determination, whether real or virtual. So that's essentially what that means. And he says, once all the dross and the obstructions are removed, participation in the overworld takes place in the form of a vision or an enlightenment. So that's essentially what the path of asceticism is for the contemplatory path. You are once you participate in it this way, you are going to reach this sort of epiphany, this realization about reality. And this is how you transcend the caste system, because you are now picturing the entire system in which the caste system exists, not just the caste system. And so you're not necessarily picturing the human modality of the quintessential reality, you are essentially picturing the quintessential reality itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of gets into a fractal picture of things where now you're seeing how the cast is just an expression of this broader picture of reality and the expression through the human spirit through its organization, if that made sense.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's essentially what he goes into in this chapter. He says the essential ideals of the essential ideals of the ascetical path are the universal as knowledge and knowledge as liberation. And so think of it as the sort of if you guys know what Gnosticism is, I'm not really an advocate of Gnosticism, but one aspect of it is essentially that the physical world you are kind of shackled to, and you need to be able to transcend this physical world to be able to participate in something greater. That's essentially what Evola is saying here with this idea of contemplation. Now that you are able to perceive because you have contemplated, you are now liberated from the shackles of this world because you know exactly how to participate in the overworld, and all of these necessary boundaries that obstruct this type of participation for someone else are no longer there to you because you understand the wider picture. It's essentially like passing the class with an A+ and then retaking the class. That's essentially what it is. And so he says the ascetical detachment. So this is another thing that I wanted to specify or emphasize in this chapter too, because this is actually very important, not just for the path of the ascetic, I think, but for everybody in general who wants to take a sort of traditional path. He says the ascetical detachment typical of the contemplative path or the contemplative path implies a renunciation. And so this is sort of like how in Christianity you would renounce your all of the earthly pleasures, the desires of the flesh, and so on and so forth. He says it implies a renunciation. In this regard, it is necessary to prevent the misunderstandings occasioned by some inferior forms of asceticism. It is important to emphasize the different meanings that renunciation assumed in higher forms of ancient and Eastern asceticism on the one hand, and in most of Western and especially Christian asceticism on the other hand. In the latter, renunciation often assumed the character of a repression and of a mortification. The Christian ascetic becomes detached from the objects of desire, not because he no longer has any desire, but in order to mortify himself and escape temptation. In the former, renunciation proceeds from a natural distaste for objects that are usually attractive and yearned for. This distaste is motivated by the fact that one directly desires, or better, wills, something of the world of conditioned experience, or something that the world of conditioned experience cannot grant. And this is one thing that I actually heavily agree with him on. One thing about Christianity and essentially the Western traditions that followed, one thing that's always sort of struck me as not odd, but sort of going against the grain, so to speak, of this idea of holism, is by not incorporating the human faculties into this sort of path of asceticism. You know, we have this idea in Christianity that to be pure, you have to repress certain aspects of humanity, and to an extent that is okay because these aspects are usually lower and physical and really only matter in the realm of temporal reality, not necessarily in any type of higher spiritual significance. But at the same time, the way in which they go about doing this is not from trying to either logically detach the person from his faculties, or anything like that. What they try to do instead is essentially suppress the faculties themselves to the point where this desire or the instinct or whatever it may be, the instinctual or carnal aspect sort of boils over and takes over any type of morality or whatever it may have been that they essentially value or are suppressing it with. And so with the Eastern path, or with the path to asceticism that Evola is trying to espouse right here, he is essentially saying that all of this stuff isn't suppressed. It is no longer desired at all. And this is because you have achieved a knowledge of something that is something that is greater than that which it is you are desiring in the first place, if that makes sense. So on the one hand, you have a spirituality that suppresses human, or you think of like the 7 deadly sins and all of that. A person is greedy, a person is lustful, all of that. There is in the Western world, you have a spirituality that just suppresses that and outright condemns it morally. And on the other hand, you have a sort of spiritual path that embraces those aspects by showing a person, or not embraces, but incorporates those aspects by showing a person that these things, these earthly desires and manifestations of will are, in a sense, illusory, and shows the person something beyond whatever form it is that is given to them by pursuing one of these sins. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that's what we spoke about in the episode with Dogma, on the issue of the priest class that we have today not really being qualified for the initiatory experience of explaining these concepts to the masses, to impart this knowledge, this esoteric concept into the exoteric form. And that is one of them, that there is this suppression of the will instead of an overcoming and elimination of the lizard brain, if you will. And that's what Evola kind of gets at a little later on here with the contemplative path, and bringing up Buddha and Meister Eckhart, and even Plotinus, talking about the pre-existent strength and light and fire within a person that was a priori to them being a physical being, or their manifestation that was created as this almost deity in a sense. Before their personhood even existed, there was this, I guess, it's hard to explain, but we went over the concept in previous chapters as well. And it's that being present there in this this nobleman type of asceticism that is on the contemplative route. And it goes there with these, carnal desires, that is not to be suppressed, but to be evaluated, accepted, overcome, and then let go of. And that's the thing that most Christians, especially in the West, don't have the proper orientation into discovering, or the explanation by the priest class that we have into understanding. And that's a bit of the issue that has existed for the past couple hundred years, well before Evola's time too, which is why he points it out and sees it in the world around him and the world around us now, which has only gotten worse.
It's essentially like you are outgrowing your desires, your carnal desires, in a sense, whereas Christianity, or not Christianity, but Western philosophy in general, suppresses these desires, or blankets them in some type of very, very thinly veiled attempt to shroud the human experience from incorporating these elements. It's the difference between that and letting the person experience these things, experience everything else, and then sort of outgrow these carnal desires or whatever it may be. In a sense, like, imagine if you had a kid who, loved sugar, right? For example, the kid loves sugar, and a parent says, you are not going to have any more sugar. We're going to not let you have any type of candy or cake or whatever it may be. And the kid throws a temper tantrum, right? And the kid, of course, is shunned by his parents and is not allowed to have any of this stuff. And sooner or later, his desire for sugar is going to overcome him, and he's going to stick his hand in the cookie jar, and he's going to take one piece. And then he's going to stick his hand in the cookie jar and take 2 cookies. Then he's going to take 3, and then he's going to take the whole jar. And that's essentially the danger you are facing when you suppress these elements. Whereas, let's say, instead, this is a very bad analogy, but this is what I come up with on the spot. Let's say instead that the parents sat him down and said, okay, well, you can have sugar, but you're also going to now have, instead of having, these artificial sugars, you're going to have natural sugars, right? And then you're going to have fruits and these other sweet things and all of that. And then, you increase his food palate to the point where when he actually eats the thing he wanted, which was, let's say, a piece of cake, he no longer feels the same about it. He no longer desires that piece of cake anymore because he's been exposed to all of these higher and more fulfilling flavors, if that makes sense. And so that's essentially what they're doing with asceticism here, or what the type of asceticism that Evola is talking about, is that
it does. Yeah, and that's... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say it does, and that's the concept I wanted to get at with my own narrative that I'm trying to write. And each of the characters there that have their own cardinal sins that they're dealing with have to fight and overcome their own inner demons before they can take to battle the exterior demons that are haunting their world. And it's that inner realization and overcoming of those desires, not just the suppression of them, because that suppression leads to an addiction, or it leads into an outburst, a sort of a what's it called when bulimics go on their splurges.
Yeah. It almost leads to a divide in personality, a sort of suppression of reality, because then when you engage or when you indulge in that type of behavior, you sort of will tell yourself, oh, I didn't do that. I didn't participate in that. So if you have this aspect of you suppressed for so long, you will essentially let that get the better of you and go and participate in some type of very immoral behavior and then say, no, that wasn't me. I didn't do that,
And people forget, even in the Christian narrative, that Jesus himself had temptations. He reflected on those temptations and he never let them overcome him because he was, well, one, the Son of God, but two, ascended in that sense from his physical, temporal body. And even though he had all of these sensations and temptations and afflictions bombarding him all throughout his life, even, him walking through the desert for 40 days and 40 nights facing Satan himself, he could withstand the onslaught because there was that depersonalization of his base desires and ascension away from them. So it's a relief of the temptations because he knew very well that if he indulged in them, he didn't have any feeling of it. The feeling was there, the affliction was there, but he knew well beyond that taking part in that or indulging in that in any sense would be for naught, and there wouldn't be any greater experience to that, even in a physical euphoric sense. It would just be kind of fizzled away in a sort of tepidness.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So that's what Evola is talking about here, is this type of asceticism, or this type of renunciation. And so you are not renouncing these things because they are morally wrong, or even though they are, you're not renouncing these things because they are morally wrong. You are renouncing them because you no longer have a desire for them. And so you have to eradicate the desire by this path of asceticism by contemplating what exactly it is, what exactly the source for that desire is, and sort of eradicating that. And that's the difference between what Evola calls what does he call it? Christian or
contemplation.
saying Western and Christian asceticism. That's what differentiates Western and Christian asceticism from what he calls Eastern asceticism. And this Eastern type of asceticism is not just in Buddhism or whatever, but you can also find it in Hinduism, or there are ascetic paths in Islam that do the same thing, although to a lesser degree, I think, than is implied in the East. But
I believe he even brings up Zoroastrianism later on as well.
Yeah, he does, and so that's where he's getting these ideas from. So that's the source of his ideas for asceticism. So he goes on to say, a typical example of contemplative asceticism is given by early Buddhism in its lack of religious features, in its organization in a pure system of techniques and in the spirit that animates it, which is so different from what anyone may think about asceticism. It talks about how Buddhism doesn't have any gods, and the gods are essentially believed to be powers who need liberation, and so the quote-unquote awakened one is acknowledged to be both superior to men and gods. And so, essentially, in Buddhism, the path of the ascetic is essentially the path that allows for participation in godhood status. And Buddhism, I think, it's not an entirely left-hand oriented religion, but it is in many senses an individualistic religion, in the sense that you have these very individualized paths that you can go down. Even in the initiatic world, the path is very individual and tailored to your own personal experience, and which makes it easy for this type of asceticism to exist, because, in a sense, everyone is God, lowercase g God. You know what I mean? In their own necessary way. And so he says, in the Buddhist canon, it is written that an ascetic can not only become free from human bonds, but from divine bonds as well. And secondly, moral norms, in the original forms of Buddhism, are purported to be mere instruments to be employed in the quest for objective realization of super-individual states. And so that again goes back to this idea of morality. And
well, I would say that Evola does talk later in the chapter too that it is the uber formed in this, that God himself, the uppercase G God, has to reach this level of asceticism to, be transcendent and be that uncreated peak of the self, without which he could not exist. Kind of paraphrasing him there. And he kind of explained in this Buddhist path of asceticism, which does kind of exist as an in-between of the left-hand and right-hand path, but one has to get chosen over the other. There can't exist a whole other path there. It is a very distinct dichotomy, but that this enlightened one, this awakened one, is like the moon standing next to the sun, where the moon is just a reflection of the radiance of the sun, and how the moon is the right-hand path, whereas the sun is the left-hand path, and that ascetic nature that transcends the hierarchy itself is the one that would be like capital G God himself. And that's why it's almost in a way unattainable for any mortal soul to really achieve. That's why we were saying it's incomprehensible. It's you wouldn't recognize it even if you saw it, because it is such a outstandingly complex and difficult thing to do that it would literally take the unmoved mover himself to be able to achieve, because it's kind of necessary within its own powers to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Essentially, it goes into one of the next sentences he talks about. He says, the fundamental principle of the method is knowledge, to turn the knowledge of the ultimate non-identity of the self with anything else into a fire that progressively devours any irrational self-identification with anything that is conditioned. So again, it's that decategorization of reality. He even says here, whether it be the monistic all or the world of Brahma, theistically conceived. So the monistic all is essentially, that monad, that essential reality that incorporates everything, that is both the source of everything and the creative force of everything, and then also everything within it. And so that is essentially what contemplation brings you, is a knowledge of that sort of monad, reality as a monad, and the way in which reality connects with each other, and the way in which every individual thing connects with every other individual thing. So that's the path of the that's the end of the contemplative path, even not just for Buddhism, but for that's the end goal of the sort of capital T traditional asceticism path as well. And so he says, to dissolve ties is not to become dissolved, but to become free. The image of one who, once freed from all yokes, whether human or divine, is supremely autonomous, and thus may go wherever he pleases. is found very frequently in the Buddhist canon together with all kinds of symbols of a virile and warrior type, and also with constant and explicit reference not so much to non-being, but rather to something superior to both being and non-being. Excuse me. And that is this this idea of the monad, which is both, it is so far unconditioned that it doesn't even have the property of being non-conditioned because it is so far out of being conditioned. It is the sort of non-contingent monistic. If there were nothing, there couldn't be nothing because there would need to be a place for nothing to exist. That's essentially what he's getting at here. It's that state of being. And so dissolving all ties or dissolving all of these categorizations that we put things into and sort of looking at being as one simple thing allows you to kind of transcend being, which is definitely a transcendence of the caste system, let alone a transcendence of temporal reality, and observe reality from this sort of God's eye view of what it all is. And that's what the path of the ascetic kind of gets at. And he says, the Buddhist renunciation is of a virile and aristocratic type and is animated by an inner strength. It is not dictated by need, but is consciously willed, so that the person practicing it may overcome need and become reintegrated into a perfect life. And this type of perfect life is, again, that participation in the quintessential reality and the renunciation of all physical desires, needs, wants, whatever that may be. That's kind of the summary of the chapter. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about with this specific one?
Well, he does, at the very end here, start to get into the path of action and how it relates to the path of contemplation, but is substantially different in the sense that it is the inverse in a way, because it is this polar nature of the paths of asceticism, whereas the contemplative path is a tranquil means of detaching oneself from the physical reality, almost sitting outside of it. In a sense, the path of action is one of the heroic and Olympian sense, this archetypal form of being, like the Heracles or the Beowulfs or the King Arthurs of our mythologies, that would embody this sort of path to be able to take physical reality as we have it, immerse yourself within it, and crank everything up to 11, and then even go beyond that to fully experience all that is within our physical reality and overcome it in that sense, to almost kind of willingly take on a sensory overload and still be able to overpower just through sheer will the forces that you let within yourself and still be able to process it all. And that is another path of ascension there that he then gets into in these next two chapters, which he goes in much greater detail.
Yeah, this path of asceticism is essentially the path of action, and this doesn't necessarily mean a warrior's action. It just means a type of action, and he says it's an action of a quote-unquote heroic life according to the sacred meaning often displayed in the traditional Eastern and Western worlds. And so essentially that means not only any type of, again, warrior action, but also heroic action in general. So like Cody was talking about with the Beowulfs and like let's say the King Arthurs or the Hercules or things like that, something of a heroic nature to it. That's what the path of action is. And so this chapter
is even...
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh, were you about to get into the 17?
Yeah, I was.
Okay. Just before we do, then it's a preface to say this is where you can really see the difference between Evola and Ganon, because Ganon was definitely much more the path of contemplation, and Evola was much more an advocate of the path of action, even though he considered himself more a contemplative person, a scholar in a sense, rather than this more dynamic form of being. Though he was a very avid, how would you say, adventurous person, climbing mountains, doing extreme sports, traveling the world in the most exotic and remote places to immerse himself in these different aspects of all that is in the physical world. And
Even going
Though
so
he
far
kind
as
of
to going so far as to leave his house and just go on walks as his city was getting bombed, in World War II.
yeah, that's also true. And he's not the only person to have done so and written about it as well during that time. There were um, many soldiers and just regular folk in the countryside of the British Army or the German Army or um, any of these different factions fighting in the war that would often willingly walk out into sight of the enemy, take on enemy fire and bombardment, and walk out unscathed and just go, that was a very tranquil walk. I enjoyed that morning stroll. And it was these madmen that just inspired their troops and gave awe to everyone around them, even respect with the enemy, that they were able to do such outstandingly insane things, or seemingly insane, but were able to do so with such decorum and control that really embodies this path of action here, because it seems like this path would be one of the wild man, of one of just letting rip all your emotions and desires, but it is a different means of control and letting go of those innate carnal afflictions that exist within the soul and expressing them in an entirely different way. Much like one of our favorite actors or personalities within the server is Christopher Lee. And he's, I think, definitely a prime example of the path of action.
Yeah, actually, what's funny is he definitely is. Because on the one hand, he, not only was he a prolific sort of intellectual, he had a huge library on occult knowledge and things like that, but he was also a...
Actually, just to pause you there, he only had about 2 or 3 books, I think. And that's where he garnered most of his knowledge from. He had an extensive library, for sure. He garnered a lot of things from, his time at Oxford, I believe. But he only had a couple books on the occult, and people would always ask him about it, but he wasn't that well read on it. He just knew more than the average person.
That's kind of my question as well. He really did seem to kind of, I don't want to say be secretive, but he kind of was. He was kind of a secretive fellow. He didn't really talk too much about his time in World War II, and he didn't really talk too much about his knowledge of the occult, but you could tell that he had some type of knowledge. You could tell he knew something. And so I feel
in
like...
World War II, I believe he was trained as SAS, so that was special forces. He was black ops, as it were. So he saw and did probably some of the most insane things you'd ever hear about, though you never would, because he had that sort of secrecy trained into him, and he was probably only selected for that special service because he had that innate aura around him already. So he knew not to have loose lips, because as the saying goes, loose lips sinks ships, and so on.
Exactly. But that's what makes me wonder about his library and whether or not, because he said he did only have a couple of books, but then he sort of employed a knowledge that was outside of the level of just a couple of books.
Yeah.
So I kind of wonder what exactly he did. But no, he is a great example.
Could be from
go ahead.
Observation and contemplation. That could be another too.
Exactly. That's kind of where I was going with that. Is that even let's say he did only have a couple of books. He did have a certain level of knowledge and at least a disposition and an orientation towards acquiring knowledge of all different types. I don't think that it's necessarily wrong. I think that I say if you read the Satanist Bible, right, it's not necessarily wrong if you are doing it to gain knowledge, right? It's how you use that knowledge that matters. And he's definitely had a disposition for knowledge, and he spoke out against, like black magic and things like that. And he said, it could take you over. So he had an extensive esoteric knowledge as well. But he was also a prolific actor, not by acting in movies, but by performing actions in a sense. So, on the one hand, he did these, like
being a performer as one of them.
Exactly. But like you said, like being a sort of special ops military type, and then performing probably some of the, like you said, some of the craziest and wildest things that exist only in most people's dreams, or in the movies and things like that. He goes from doing that to, acting in these movies, and all the while having this very charismatic, proper, almost aristocratic aura about him, where he does not deviate from this sort of upstanding, gentlemanly archetype that he's made for himself, or that he's sort of adhered to. And this is one of those things. That's why he is one of those people who very much, I would say, embodies at least the modern characteristics of an ascetic. I don't know if I'd call him an ascetic, because I don't know if that was his goal, but he's definitely one who possessed the closest capability out of quite a few people who existed in his time, quite a few of his contemporaries. And
you don't even have to be consciously on the path of asceticism. You just have to do it. Because like we said with the left-hand versus right-hand path, so many people that consciously go into it are doing so for the sake of some sort of power or of some gain in a material sense, and that's why they ultimately do themselves to fail. But the people who can go on that left-hand path have that predestination in them, like what Evola just said, in that light and fire that existed deistically before they manifested as a person themselves, that eminence that was a priori to their very being.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And so this path of action, I think it actually, one of the best ways to characterize the path of action, I think, is to kind of like imagine an artist or a musician, or even a warrior, but more like a martial artist or something like that, who gets lost in
things
their
Christopher
work.
Lee all did as well.
Exactly, right. That's why he was such an amazing fellow. He was just he was a very well-rounded person and practiced all of these different traditions with a certain vigor and propriety and level of skill.
Was he
Skillfulness.
What French king was he a direct descendant of again?
Oh, I don't necessarily remember. He was Italian as well. I know that much. But
I dare to say Charlemagne, but I'm not sure. I don't want to.
Most Europeans are descendants of Charlemagne.
Direct descendant, like could have a claim to some sort of throne, in a sense. I forget which one exactly, but he had that, within his blood, that sense of regality, and even in all the his most famous roles, not to get too caught up on Christopher Lee, but even his most famous roles, Dracula, Saruman, Count Dooku, that's just who he was. This dark, eminent figure of action that ultimately got defeated by whatever other forces were the protagonists of the story he was in, but were these larger than life type of encapsulations of all that is in being.
Yeah, and his life really did manifest this path of asceticism in both ways. Like we kind of just were talking about, he very much was this manifestation of the principle of both the path of action and the path of contemplation, because I think he did it for the sake of doing it, and doing it for the sake of doing it doesn't necessarily mean not necessarily in the you only live once sort of downwards oriented type of participation in a dangerous activity for the sake of being dangerous or taking a risk, but he was doing it for the sake of having the experience and the knowledge gained from having done it. It's almost as if he lived his life as someone who had already done all of those things, doing those things, if that makes sense. It's sort of an a priori knowledge that he had when accomplishing all of his tasks. And I don't know if that was just due to his confidence or his charisma, or if he actually did, sort of manifest these qualities within himself, but he was definitely a man who did this type of thing. And so this path of doing, or this idea of action, doing it for the sake of doing it, that is essentially, like I said, imagine a painter or a martial artist or a musician, or let's say a chess player, or anything you can imagine, something of some kind where a person is engaging in a certain skill. And imagine where this person just gets lost in their activity, where a musician starts playing the music and sort of all of time stops for them, and they just essentially are. They almost are the music themselves. They are the performance themselves, and I feel like everyone has experienced this at least once, and if they were engaging with some kind of passion that they were pursuing, everyone has, I think, at least experienced this once. Where, let's say you're writing and you just get lost in the words, or you are, like I said, performing. You're playing a piano and you just get lost in the music, or you are, like I said, playing chess or sword fighting or whatever it may be, right? And you just get lost in this. That is what this path of action represents, because now you are shedding quite literally all of your temporal qualities. It doesn't matter that it's, 2022, or it doesn't matter if it was 1922 or at any time, because you are now engaging with this quintessential reality through this medium by sort of engaging with it on a personal level and using all of the skills and the attributes that you are predisposed for to participate in this reality in this way by sort of enacting these things around you. And it's almost like, like I said, it is getting lost in your activity. And I think Evola says here somewhere, maybe it was in this chapter or the next one, but in a sense, the warrior kind of manifests this principle as well by simply getting lost in battle and using his physical means to signify a spiritual warfare. That's what this next chapter kind of goes into. But that's what this path of action really represents, is this sort of adhering to the archetypal activity, in a sense, where you are one musician who has access to the archetypal music, or you are one chess player that has access to the archetypal game. It might sound dumb, but it's kind of the best way to interpret this type of action, because that's really what it means, is by adhering to this higher mode of being through this temporal vehicle that drives you to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, Evola kind of gets into that later on in chapter 17, the Greater and Lesser Holy War, where he's explaining, first off, on the relationship between the warriors of different societies, whether he's talking about the Samnite warriors, and how Livy kind of describes them as initiates, or as the populations in pre-colonial Mexico of the Mayans or Aztecs or whomever. I think it was Aztecs at that time. Of their actions being initiatory in their trials for this ascetic path, or even the samurai as being a sort of a other side to the coin of Zen from the esoteric side of Buddhism, and all of them kind of showing in this path the path of the warrior as a means of action to overcome this fervor that they get, this almost like out-of-body experience that many people like,
out-of-body
experience. Artists, artists, musicians, fighters, or whomever will experience at some point, because they are so in tune with their craft, with their discipline, and they get so good at it that it is almost unconscious. People will often say that, oh, he's fighting or he's playing like a man possessed, but it's not really a possession unless it's of your own spirit. It is where you are in most control of what you are doing, but you are so invested in it, like Vincent was explaining, that you are doing it unconsciously, because that physical consciousness that you relate to our contemporary world goes into a higher plane of existence, and now you don't really have any, I don't want to say recollection, it's almost like a dreamlike state of things where you just do it, to like Vincent said, do it. And it's not that the lower orientation of that, it's you know what to do before you know what to do, in a sense. It's this preordainment in a way that you're getting like beamed divine knowledge directly into your head, or beyond that, because it's ascendant to where you are in that state, and your body is kind of just at the command of this higher spiritual form that you're in, and it's almost being puppeteered by your higher nature. I'm not sure if that makes entirely a lot of sense, but I hope I got the message through to some people.
Yeah, exactly. It is that. It is that out-of-body experience where it is sort of like you lose all sense of consciousness, not because you are unconscious, but because you are almost super conscious. And that's kind of what Evola gets at in these chapters, is the path of asceticism and the paths that that lead to asceticism sort of, in a sense, lead to a super conscious experience where, like you said, out of body and are in a sense participation in this timeless mode of being. That and the reason that it is archetypal is because all people of whatever tradition or whatever activity it is, everyone who is predisposed to that activity participates in this activity in this same way, if that makes sense. And so you might have a modern soccer player who is very good at soccer and in a sense loses himself in the act, and this person is participating in the game of soccer in the same way that a ball player in ancient Greece or ancient Mesopotamia might have participated in sport as well, because it is the same principle of being an athlete, of using your body to participate in a game. And I'm using this example because this is kind of relevant to the chapter after this, which is Games and Victory too.
Yeah. I was going to say you're getting a little ahead of yourself, but I like where you're going.
Yeah. And it's essentially this idea of participating in the archetypal. You could have a 17th century pianist and a 21st century cellist, and they're both participating in music in the same way. If they achieve this otherworldly or out of body or super conscious status of participating in this activity that sort of exists throughout the centuries in the modes in which they are able to participate in it with. And that's kind of the path of action. And the reason it's called the path of action is because it is simply acting. It is that is why I think you lose all consciousness, is because you are no longer contemplating. You no longer have that what did Evola call it? The knowledge of, or the faculty of knowledge, the knowing faculty. The knowing faculty is sort of suppressed to the acting faculty, which is essentially that participation in this activity. And
or not even suppressed, it just moves out of the way from.
Essentially the acting faculty takes precedence over the knowing faculty because it is, in a sense, superior in that moment to all other things which could try to overtake it, I think is kind of a good way to put it. And so in this chapter here, he talks about how the path of action manifests in the times of war. And this chapter is called The Greater and Lesser Holy War because the topic of the chapter itself relates to this idea of a greater and lesser type of being, where on the one hand, like I said, you have the greater being, which is that metaphysical, quintessential, archetypal, essential, all of that. And then the lesser type is that substantial, manifestation, temporal, formal, relative type of being. And the greater and lesser holy war, they represent these qualities exactly as such, where he says that considering that in the traditional view of the world, every reality was a symbol and every action a ritual. The same was true in the case of war. Since war could take on a sacred character, holy war and the path to God became one in the same thing. And so this idea of the greater and lesser, it is manifested in the traditional view that every reality is a symbol and every action is a ritual. The lesser is a manifestation of the greater. And so, in a sense, the lesser war, or what is the earthly war, is in a sense a manifestation of a higher type of war, a metaphysical war, if you will, or a war between powers. And he goes on to say, the ancient worldview and myths in which the theme of antagonism repeatedly occurred automatically propelled the elevation of the art of war to a spiritual plane. This was the case of the Persian Aryan tradition and also of the Hellenic world, which often saw in material warfare the reflection of a perennial cosmic struggle between the spiritual Olympian Uranian element of the cosmos on the one hand, and the titanic, demonic, feminine, unrestrained elements of chaos on the other hand. So, in every traditional path, you will find the idea of the greater and lesser holy war, which is manifested through the idea of actual war. And this is what the warriors use to justify themselves in combat, but it's also the war that they participate in through the means of actual war, for physical war. They participate in this greater war by participating archetypally through this lesser war, if that makes sense. And so this chapter details all quite a laundry list of traditions in which the holy war is an idea, but the holy war is essentially that. It is the war of greater forces of order and of absolutity and universality against the forces of chaos, relativity, and substantiality, if that makes sense. Do you have anything you want to add at this point?
No, that's exactly where I was going to go afterwards, is the greater and lesser holy war, in a sense. I don't know if it would be going too far ahead, but what did you have going from there?
Oh, well, in a sense, I was just kind of going to go through some of the examples that Evola listed and talk about the significance of the holy war and why each of these paths have an emphasis on it.
Gotcha. Okay. So then, where I was going to go next with the holy war, and I'm trying to find the quotation here, because he has a lot of quotations in this chapter, but one specifically in the Christian tradition that I wanted to get to, that he brings up to speak to the Christian audience that hopefully we're speaking to, especially people in our modern contemporary spheres that are so averse to this path that, like we mentioned, Christianity kind of moves in a way, or emphasizes in a way, this contemplative path, but it has the path of action has been suppressed in many ways by this overabundance of contemplation in many senses. And I just wanted to get to that. So where do you want to go while I'm looking for it?
Oh, sure. I'll just go from the just in order. So he says, special views concerning one's fate in the afterlife introduce us to the inner meanings of warrior asceticism. According to Aztec and Nahua races, the highest seat of immortality, the house of the sun, or the house of, I'm going to mispronounce this, the house of Huitzilopochtli, was reserved not only for sovereigns, but for heroes as well. So, in a sense, the highest house or heaven is not necessarily just for the kings or for the philosopher king or the regal caste, but is also held for heroes, which are essentially ascetics or warrior ascetics. And so he says, as far as ordinary people were concerned, they were believed to slowly fade away in a place analogous to the Hellenic Hades. So again, we talked a little bit about the afterlife in that previous chapter called the two paths in the afterlife, which essentially detailed the participation in a divine type of afterlife, which was that higher or greater mode of being, and then the lesser type of afterlife, which was essentially that participation in hell, or the repetitive action of Hades, or something of that hell in the Norse terminology of hell, Helheim, or hell with one L, or however you want to call that. This lesser type of participation, that was for the common folk, the common caste, or the uninitiated, and then this greater type for the initiated was held in Valhalla, or in the House of the Sun, as it is put in Aztec spirituality, or in heaven in the Christian terms. And these all represent the holding place, or the afterlife, for not only just, like I said, the regal archetype, not only just for the philosopher king, not only just for the person who adheres to their caste and participates in some type of spirituality or quintessential reality, but also for the ascetic too. Someone who practices that left-hand path and succeeds in this type of participation, this direct connection to the higher plane of reality. And so he says the Nordic Aryan mythology, again, like I mentioned, he said the Nordic Aryan mythology conceived Valhalla as a seat of heavenly immortality reserved for the heroes fallen on the battlefield, in addition to nobles and free men of divine origin. This seat was related to the symbolism of heights, as Glitnirbjorg, the resplendent mountain, or Himinbjorg, the heavenly mountain. I'm sorry, I'm butchering these names. The highest divine mountain.
Funny words, man. Funny words.
Exactly. The highest divine mountain on whose peaks an eternal brightness shines beyond the clouds. It was often identified with Asgard, namely with the Aesir seat located in the Middle Land. And the lord of the seat was Odin, the Nordic god, yada yada yada. And so, essentially, he goes into how the greater war is manifested in the principles of. How the principles of the greater war is manifested in the action of the lesser war, or participating in the lesser war. And he says, now what has been so far concerns the transformation of war into a holy war, which is essentially like I said, the participation of the individual in the action of war leads the individual to spiritually participate in the greater war that is going on between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. And so, even if both foes are orderly or manifest this divine attribute to them, and they are fighting against each other, both warriors on both sides, or all warriors on both sides, are participating or have the capability or potential to participate in this greater war, this greater holy war. So, the greater war represents that spiritual battle between the absolute and the relative, or order and chaos, and the lesser war represents the war that is happening on Earth. That's what these two represent. Sorry.
And I did like where he was going next after that with the Islamic tradition and the distinction between them. Whereas the words of the Prophet and the Hadith go, you've returned from the lesser holy war to the greater holy war. The greater holy war, that being of the inner spiritual nature of being, and the greater, and the lesser holy war being that of the external fight of bringing the air quote infidel to the law of God. And that's even iterated in the Bible, or I guess it's iterated in the Quran from the Bible, with sayings like, and I found it now, whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. And that's Matthew 16:25. And there are other passages, even in the New Testament, that sort of reinforce this warrior mentality in a certain way. But it is the more narrow path under the Christian doctrine. Whereas in Islam, it is a much wider path because they have the jihad, which is the holy war, that is meant to be a actionable sort of what's the right word? A compelling force into action. And Evola even states here, one of the sayings that is common in Islam is march in the cause of Allah, you linger, why is it that when it is said to you, march in the cause of Allah, you linger slothfully in the land? Are you content with this life in preference to the life to come? And that's that call to action in order to not just sit idly around and, be complacent within the material, temporal reality that we have, but to bring yourself into certain actions, into certain disciplines, into that ascetic path to transcend and prepare yourself for the next life, which far outweighs that of this one. Whereas Evola explains that in Islam, this life is seen as a pastime or as a sport, in a sense, in which you are, actively participating in, and you have to, do your best at. But it's more or less, I don't want to say irrelevant. It's not the main goal to, to be the all-star of the team. It's something more transcendent in that sense, in looking beyond the game itself.
It doesn't have a material aspect to it at all. And that's essentially what we're getting at here. And when you were talking about Christianity sort of avoiding this this aspect of war, you were absolutely correct in the temporal sense, or not the temporal, in the modern or contemporary sense. And it's funny because Christianity does actually have a idea for not necessarily jihad, but it has an equivalent for holy war itself, and in the theories of just war. For example,
the Crusades.
Yeah, the Crusades. Yeah, baby. Exactly. No, but seriously, Saint Augustine, for example, he said about those who are waging war. He says, "They who have waged war in obedience to the divine command, or in conformity with his laws, have represented in their persons the public justice of the wisdom of government, and in this capacity have put to death wicked men. Such persons have by no means violated the commandment, thou shalt not kill. But say they, the wise man will wage just wars, as if he would not all the rather lament the necessity of just wars, if he remembers that he is a man. For if they were not just, he would not wage them, and would therefore be delivered from all wars." And so this is essentially this is St. Augustine. Thomas Aquinas is another, Christian philosopher who has this qualification for just war. He says that first the war must be waged upon the command of a rightful sovereign, and the war needs to be waged for a just cause. So for like if the people who are waging the war are wronged in some way. Thirdly, the warriors must have the right intent, namely to promote good and to avoid evil. And that's the most important aspect right there, is to promote good and avoid evil. And both of these are, in a sense, reasons to wage holy war against wickedness or decay or evil, or whatever you would like to characterize it as in the Christian theology. And so this idea of jihad in Islam is not so far off from Christianity, except for the fact that in Christianity there has always been, not always been, but necessarily always been, a detachment between two different aspects of it, essentially the greater aspect and the lesser aspect. In the same way that the initiatic esoteric aspect was disconnected from the more formal doctrinal exoteric aspect, the sort of warrior aspect was connected with that esoteric aspect, and the contemplative aspect was connected to that exoteric formal aspect. And I don't think this was done either intentionally or by accident. I think it just happened to be that way, because the contemplatory path obviously had to do with doctrinal aspects, and the warrior path obviously had to do with a more individual understanding of theology. And so, in a sense, the warrior element of Christianity died with the Templars, died with the esoteric aspect of Christianity, and was never really manifest again. You could see it come about, traces of it came about in, the Enlightenment and with expansion into Africa and things like that, but that was really more of a shallow justification for, I think it was more of a prejudice-driven wars and economic-driven wars, rather than holy wars or things like that, things of a proper sort, you know what I mean? And so...
Yeah, of course, and you can even see that in the canonization of some saints in the Christian tradition, like Joan of Arc, and her becoming at the end of the 100 Years' War, and having this, providence, this divine intervention of God personally calling her to take up arms and, rally men to go fight the English, and then doing so, which, for the 15th century, completely unheard of, completely asinine to have essentially this unknown peasant woman, a woman at all, to be fighting on the front lines of a war, and then her not only doing that, kicking ass in the process, surviving multiple battles, and then only being injured while she's scaling a fortifications wall, and then only kind of, coming to her end by the hands of the church, who didn't believer anyways, but she led, like her actions led to the consequence of the French winning the war in the first place. So it very much, you can see that it's anyone who can be called upon in this action and be a true form of this ascetic path to transcend the nature of things. And Joan of Arc is one of those good examples of such as well, because she not only broke that glass ceiling in a sense, going outside not just the caste but the sexual dimorphism that existed in that time and in that place.
Let's not forget that she was also 19 years old when she died.
Yeah, but like so many accomplishments in such a short time, just because God went, all right, you're gonna do this now, and she went, okay, and did it. That was the call to action was received and carried out, and it brought about the consequence of France's eventual victory in the war.
Exactly. That's a very good analogy too, because she had all of those aspects within her that adhered to the outside of caste, outside of gender specificity, outside of even age in a sense, because usually at that age you are under a knight or under some type of noble or something like that. You are just barely beginning your initiation, or at the very least you are some type of journeyman, but you're not the organizer or the face of it all. You know what I mean? And she was, and that's essentially she's an anomaly in that regard, and that's what represents the path of the ascetic. And you could say that she was participating in it in a higher mode as well. She represented a war that was not just an earthly war, but a holy war as well. And the church, recognized that after, a period of time, and incorporated her within their canon. So essentially, yeah. And contrasting that also with the Islamic tradition, the passage that you read, there's another passage here. He says, "It is written in the Quran, let those who would exchange the life of this world for the hereafter fight for the cause of Allah. Whether they die or conquer, we shall richly reward them." The presupposition according to which it is prescribed, "When you meet the unbelievers in the battlefield, strike off their heads, and when you have laid them low, bind your captives firmly, or do not falter or sue for peace when you've gained the upper hand," is that the life of this world is but a sport and a pastime, and that whoever is ungenerous to this cause is ungenerous to himself. So he's comparing quotes to each other, but in a sense he's using these quotes in an order that signifies that Islam also has this idea of the holy war. And so that's what makes the Crusades so interesting, is that you have two juxtaposed sects of people fighting this holy war on the one hand, which is also a holy war in the exoteric sense as well. Holy war over the holy sites, if you will, the Holy Land. And in a sense, it's a holy war on three stages, because you have that individual warrior's ethos mixed in with the devotion of the warrior to his religion or to his faith, and then the actual participation in that higher spirituality in the realm of absolute being, or whatever you'd like to call it, quintessential reality. And so essentially the Crusades manifests a triple layered holy war, which is very interesting, because it's these two very similar traditions juxtaposed against each other for an earthly or worldly cause and concern that eventually leads everyone to participate in this holy war, the greater holy war, which is very interesting.
And that's reinforced further by, and I wanted to bring this up before I brought up Joan of Arc, but on what you just said right there and a bit previously, the quote that Evola brings up from Krishna, that goes, I am all powerful time, which destroys all things. I have come here to slay these men. Even if thou dost not fight, all the warriors facing thee shall die. Arise therefore, win thy glory, conquer thy enemies, and enjoy thy kingdom. Through fate, their own karma, I have doomed them to die. Be thou merely the means of my work. Tremble not, fight and slay them. Thou shalt conquer thy enemies in battle. And it's essentially saying that, you will die, as is all things that face with the mortality of time, but do so in pursuit of something greater than yourself, because that is, what I imbued you to do. And that's something I'd say is inspiring in a sense, because that again, like with Islam and jihad, it's a motivating factor to get people not to be idle and I don't want to say contemplative, because contemplative is on the other side of the ascetic, but in a complacent is the right word, state of mind. And that's what many Christians in society, in Western society, do now as well, with this Protestant evangelical type of mindset where, oh, it's God's plan, let things be as they ought. And I believe we brought this up before. I've spoke about it on other people's shows, like Brandon Bonanza, who we alluded to before but didn't name, and conversations I've had with other people, that it is not just to say that, oh, it's in God's plan, things will work themselves out. No. God's plan is the path that he has set for you to be the truest path you are supposed to follow. And you can walk that path or deviate from it at any time. But it requires your action to walk down the path. You can just sit on the path stagnantly and say, oh, it's in God's plan, I'll find out what's at the end of my path eventually. But you never will if you're just sitting in the middle of your path, not moving, and thinking that, some gust of wind or some other exterior force is going to move you down further the path. Maybe it might, but not all the way there. You actually have to get up and walk and do the work yourself. Do that call to action, like Joan of Arc or like any of these other examples we're bringing up, to actually find yourself at the end of that calling that you were meant to do. And that's even if you're on the path in the first place. You could be lost in the woods for all we know. But it's and I think that is very much the case with many of these Christians who've been led astray, led away from the flock, as it were, because of the constant assault on scripture and misinterpretations of different sects in modern society that have been twisted in so many different forms, as well as overtaken in the sense of that contemplative path, which, is there, but isn't being adhered to because so many people don't understand that that's even the path in the first place. If that made sense as well.
Yeah,
we've been saying that a lot, but there's a lot to cover in this episode.
If things make sense, they make sense, and if they don't, they don't. We'll just run with it. It's very much like, imagine if you designed a robot, right? You designed a robot to walk down the hallway from point A to point B, and you have this design all mapped out. You have the blueprints and the all of it works on paper. You have where you need to put the batteries and where you need to put the arms and the mechanics and the legs and all of that, and then you buy all the parts. And then you assemble all the parts, but the robot doesn't turn on until you turn it on, right? But now you're expecting the robot to walk from point A to point B without the robot actually walking, or without you actually doing anything to have the robot go down to point A to point B. It's essentially that. God's plan is only a plan. It's not necessarily going to act out itself. You need to adhere to the plan. All agents of the plan need to adhere to the plan. And that's actually, funny enough, that's what metaphysics represents, is I think that saying, quote unquote, God's plan, like saying those words, is a way to characterize metaphysics to people who do not have a disposition or a care to understand what metaphysics actually is, right? Because metaphysics is just the design of reality. It is the domain where the design of reality exists in a pure state. And so just because metaphysics exists doesn't necessarily mean that all substantial physics adheres to it, right? There's that relative aspect with physicality that doesn't exist metaphysically, and usually that's accounted for, or at least in a historic sense, with Christians and with Muslims and things like that. They account for this disconnect, this relative element, and try to adhere to what is archetypal, or try to adhere to the plan. The plan equals the design, and if you do not adhere to the design, you are not adhering to the plan, and thus the plan will not go as planned, And so that's the thing with these, with the God's plan argument, where it will say like, oh, we don't need to do X, Y, and Z, even though, A, B, and C is terrible, because that's all part of God's plan. Well, if every agent is not acting as it should in God's plan, then God's plan won't go the way it's supposed to go. And that's
And I mean,
that's what we're
maybe it makes sense if you're a Calvinist because you discount the idea of free will anyways, but if, you follow the scriptural tradition and have half a brain, you can see that that's not quite how it works anyways, because free will is an active part of the experiment of life, as it were. And God willing it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It's just that, it's there. We either pick it up and roll with it, or run with it, or we don't.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of arguments saying, well, like, oh, if God wills it, then why doesn't it just happen? Because God can do whatever he wants. But it's like God, a superconscious will and a structure of reality are two different things. The way a superconscious will is subordinate to the construction of reality because consciousness is subordinate to that generative principle. You know what I mean? So it's just even adherence to this type of divine or the idea that this type of divine will can manifest whatever it wants isn't necessarily true, because the laws of reality have already been established by the degree in which this divine will participates, if that makes sense. And this essentially, the divine will or God participates within God, and that's essentially why these characteristics don't align very well. These relative characteristics don't align very well, and why every agent in the design has to act according to the design, because the will comes secondary to the design. And that's kind of a hard topic to grasp, and I don't necessarily think this is the podcast to get into it in, but it's interesting if you want to get into theology and all of that stuff. But so most of the rest of this chapter is just detailing the idea of the greater and the lesser holy war. But as he kind of wraps it up, he says, one last bit about the Crusaders. He says, the Crusader was promised a share in the absolute glory and the quote-unquote rest in paradise. In the coarse language of the time, conquere lit en paradis, which I can imagine is conquer and live in paradise in Latin, which is the same kind of supernatural rest mentioned in the Quran. So, like I said, the Christian warriors and the Muslim warriors were promised the same type of participation in the same type of higher spirituality and all of that, even though they were juxtaposed to each other physically. He says, likewise, Jerusalem, the military objective of the Crusades, appeared in the double aspect of an earthly and of a heavenly city, and thus the Crusade became the equivalent in terms of a heroic action, or in terms of heroic tradition, of a ritual, a pilgrimage, and the passion of Via Crucis. Moreover, those who belonged to the orders that contributed the most to the Crusades, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights of St. John, were men who, like the Christian monks or ascetics, learned to despise the vanity of this life. These orders were the natural retirement place for those warriors who were wary of the world, who had seen and experienced just about everything, and who had directed their spiritual quest towards something higher. So this again goes back to fulfilling that idea of an inner rejection of the temporal world that comes about when you have been introduced to things that are wider than just the temporal world. It's like in Lord of the Rings, right? When Frodo goes and destroys the ring and comes back, and the Shire isn't necessarily what it is anymore. He doesn't care about all of these earthly desires and all of the petty squabbles of the hobbits in the Shire. It's really his trip to Mordor has changed him for good, and he doesn't desire this lowly rabble anymore. He desires something greater, and that's why he leaves and goes and leaves to the Undying Lands, to Valinor, right? Because that signifies him participating in the quintessential reality and him leaving physical reality, which is signified by the Shire. And so that's what the Crusades typify for the for the warrior ascetic. And later in the chapter, he says, moreover, those who love to contrast the past with our recent times should consider what modern civilization has brought to us in terms of war. A change of level has occurred. From the warrior who fights for the honor and for the right of his lord, society has shifted to the type of the mere soldier that is found in association with the removal of all transcendent or even religious elements in the idea of fighting. To fight on the path to God has been characterized as medieval fanaticism. Conversely, it has been characterized as a most sacred cause to fight for patriotic and nationalistic ideas, and for other myths that in our contemporary era have eventually been unmasked and shown to be the instruments of irrational, materialistic, and destructive forces. It has gradually become possible to see that when country was mentioned, this rallying cry often concealed the plans of annexation and oppression in the interest of monopolistic industries. All talk of heroism was done by those who accompanied the soldiers to the train stations. Soldiers went to the front to experience war as something else, namely as a crisis that all too often did not turn out to be an authentic and a heroic transfiguration of the personality, but rather the regression of the individual to a plane of savage instincts, reflexes, and reactions that retain very little of the human by virtue of being below and not above humanity. And so he goes on to say that the era of nationalism has known a worthy surrogate for the two great traditional culminations that are the universality of spiritual authority and the heroic universality. And he's referring to imperialism. And so he goes on to talk about that a little bit. But it's interesting that he brings up this idea because it was the holy war, or the justification for holy war in religious circles, was not dominated by this aspect of either a war for a country or a war for a race or a war for some type of material, for money, right? For greed, for lust, for women even. It wasn't justified by any of that. It was justified by the spiritual regality of those for whom each side fought. That was what it was justified by. And now it's justified by these lowly sort of ideals, which are the common caste, third estate-oriented ideals, such as nation, or, what does he say here, patriotic, nationalistic ideals, and other myths that our contemporary era has, shown to be materialistic.
Or even worse nowadays, in this corporatized industrial process, that's more of a means of monetary acquisition instead of, even for something like a race or a country or some other, at least collective ideal, but rather a far more condensed, almost individualized pursuit of greed.
Yeah, definitely. And so both of these examples show the justification of war being something that is below a spiritual type of tradition or significance. It is a material significance, whether that be for the conquest of land, simply for money's sake, or for the idea of the nation, which is a sort of subpersonal characterization based on certain physical traits such as borders or linguistics or what have you, all things like that. Not necessarily through any spiritual significance, such as like the rite, the RITE, or the the path to asceticism, or things like that. And so he contrasts the different types of warriors that you could find in either tradition or either situation as well, where on the one hand you have these knightly, divine warrior king figures, the warrior ascetic figures, who participate in this war by virtue of spirituality, and the soldier, who is sort of this numbered individual, this quantified individual, and this quantified mass of people getting shot out to be, shipped out to be mowed down by machine gun fire or what have you. And so they
bombs and chemical weapons and so forth.
Exactly.
That Evola states is, just mass means of extermination that leave no hope or way out for the individual to find a heroic pursuit.
And so he emphasizes the regression of the individual, quote unquote, to a plane of savage instincts, reflexes, and reactions. And so essentially he equates the soldier to the lesser type of being, and the knight or the ascetic warrior to the greater type of being. But he also specifies that this world does not allow for the warrior ascetic to exist anymore, because the types of wars that we wage and the way in which we wage them are so different in circumstance from the wars that were waged back then. And in a sense, Napoleon didn't fight like a gentleman, you know what I mean? And nobody now fights like a gentleman. And so the entire meaning of war is lost to this mechanized modern warfare. And it's funny because I mentioned Lord of the Rings a little bit ago, but Tolkien identified this in his works as well. And he identified the true and the good and the beautiful, in the hobbits and in Gondor and the elves and all of that, the sacred traditions and whatnot. And he identified this leveling, egalitarian mechanization in the form of the orcs and Sauron and all of that. And this is essentially what he said you would get if you were to, mechanize warfare and get rid of all of these activities which raise people's ontological statuses to the level of the hero. So that was an interesting thing. That's kind of the note he ends off as well. He says, rational systems of mass extermination are being employed that leave no hope and no way out. Such systems could once have been devised only to exterminate germs and insects. In contrast to medieval superstitions that referred to a holy war, what our contemporaries consider sacred and worthy of the actual progress of civilization is the fact that millions of human beings, taken away en masse from their occupations and vocations, which are totally alien to the military vocation, and literally turned into what military jargon refers to as cannon fodder, will die in such events. And that's how he kind of ends this chapter, which is kind of a dark note, but a very true one. And
that is from his experience seeing World War II
exactly
up close and personal.
Too.
And World War, he was just a boy then as well, wasn't he?
I think he fought in World War I. Did he not? I think he...
Perhaps. I forget.
I'm going to look this up right now.
Well, on the fly. But
he served as artillery officer in the First World War.
Ah, how old was he then?
He
1819?
1898.
1898.
So he must...
Yeah, he'd be 19.
About 19, yeah.
Oh,
just
so,
about.
Yeah, he got in right at the end. So, yeah. Wow. I wonder if he ever fought against or alongside Hitler then, because Hitler was on the fronts as well.
Well, he was Italian, so...
Oh, yeah, were they in the Entente as well?
I don't know if that's by the time they changed sides. I don't know when he fought. But I do know that...
Italy and constantly changing sides. That's an aside, though.
Exactly.
But moving on to Chapter 18 now, Games and Victory. This is the peacetime equivalent of, or what should be the peacetime equivalent of that call to action, that ascetic path of action in which, antiquity was able to put within ritualistic bounds to raise sportsmen or athletes up into a status likened to the gods or of demigods and so forth, going so far out as, having certain games be reenactments, in a sense, of the myths of various gods fighting each other. And the events that are held in these games are the trials and tribulations that are expounded upon or are allegorical to those that, figures like Hercules might have had to overcome in his trials.
Yeah. What's funny is I didn't even remember that part. But yeah, that is exactly what these games represent. Is they do kind of signify a reenactment of the various myths. And that's the thing that that characterizes the RITE right, or the maintenance of the rights for divine regality as well. So the same type of maintenance of the rights that also maintain the regality of the individual, or the status of the king or the initiated individual, are also signified in Games and Victory. And yeah, that's essentially what this chapter is about. Is about understanding how the games correspond, or how games correspond to the same type of path of action as the warrior idea, and like Cody said, in peacetime. He starts off by saying, in classical antiquity, games had a sacred character, and they therefore became typical expressions of the traditional path of action. It was considered dangerous to neglect the sacred games. Thus, if the state's funds were depleted, the games were simplified but never suppressed. In ancient Roman law required the duoviri and the ideales to have the games celebrated in honor of the gods. And a little bit later on, he says, In any event, the person in charge of the games in Rome was always a representative of the official patrician religion. In the case of some games, such as the Analyses, special priestly colleges were formed for the occasion. These games were closely related to pagan temples that Christian emperors had no choice but to keep them open, since shutting them down would have caused those games to be cancelled. These games even outlasted most ancient Roman institutions and eventually ended with the Roman Empire itself. And so he goes on later to say in a later paragraph, he says, the games assumed the characters of res divinae, and they have been replaced today by contemporary sports and by the plebeian infatuation with them. In the Hellenic tradition, the institution of the most important games bore a close relationship with the struggle of the Olympian, heroic, and solar forces against natural and elemental forces. So like Cody said, a reenactment of the various myths and legends that characterize the victory of order over chaos, or the Olympian principle over the Titanic principle. And this is where he brings up the idea of Hyperborea. So he says the Pythian games in Delphi celebrated Apollo's triumph over Python and his victory of this Hyperborean god in contest with the other gods. He says, likewise, the Olympian games were related to the idea of triumph of the heavenly race over the race of the Titans. So he goes on to talk about Hercules and all of that, and the Roman arenas and things like that. And it's funny because games, actually, if you look at the types of games that existed back then, they are very different in character to the games that we have today, which are, like he says, a plebeian-oriented, materialistic type of almost organized entertainment, whereas before they signified the real transcendence of the players that took part in them, in a sense. And so
I was just gonna bring that up because there was something I wrote. I think it was, let's see now. Ooh, excuse me. Yes, last year's Super Bowl the 2022 Super Bowl. Kind of expounding on that, if I may.
Yeah, definitely.
And I write that ignoring the consumerist mindset and idol worship the masses display towards sports, the accomplishments in these arenas by athletes is worthy of their status. We all know the masses are less than intellectually capable. I use a more profane word there, but try to keep it highbrow as we can. Hence why I ask to ignore their behavior so as not to confuse what they do with the sport or athlete themselves. And as Evola said, many of these sports outlasted the empires or civilizations that originated them in the first place. And even though they lost some of that ritualistic element to them, there is still some spark of, divine idealism there, at least within the players playing themselves.
I was going to say the same thing. Go ahead.
I say here that, like the gladiator of old, the men who compete in contact sports would be soldiers and generals. In fact, many of them are. These are men of exceptional ability, many times being genetic freaks, able to accomplish what the common man could never. Yes, the degree of their wealth and status is inflated in today's society, but the wealthiest athlete to ever live was a Roman chariot racer. So, the burden of men maintaining what is peak human physicality while risking life and limb necessitates affluence. The problem shouldn't be that these mock warriors are treated so well, but why our joke of a warrior class isn't maintained to the same standards, if you can even argue we have a warrior class in the first place. Hell, even the rest of society should be kept to the same degree of dedication to their crafts and disciplines as athletes dedicate to their bodies in sport, and maybe our civilization wouldn't be collapsing. The problem is that apathy and nihilism are far easier mindsets to live by than the pain and struggle of success. Be the deadliest gladiator of your arena. And that wasn't one of my more popular posts, but it was well received.
I really like that. That touches upon the entire aspect of this chapter right here. And it's funny because what you say in that post essentially does kind of embody what I was thinking as well. It encapsulates what I was thinking as well, because the athletes of today, while there are many who are, commercialized and who overstep their bounds, I think, in many ways.
Sometimes forced to by the
institution,
commercialistic institutions that put them on stage and make them dance like
the
trained
show
monkeys
ponies,
in a sense,
and
show ponies or whatever.
Yeah, but the general athlete, I say, does still have access to this type of participation in the same way that we have access to this type of participation in the Kali Yuga. You know, all of our um, all of our access points to spirituality have been dampened a bit and are muffled in a sense. There's a sort of um, there's a sort of cloth over all of our access to spirituality, but in the ways that we do still have access to this type of participation in quintessential reality, we see that the athlete is no less potent in relation to all of us than it was in relation to all of the common cast people back in the day. And so, yeah, that's a very good. You should. I think we should ignore the commercial and plebeian infatuation with the athlete in general, and we should seriously take into consideration the more individualistic aspects of what the athlete experiences when he is in a game, and what happens when he wins the game. Okay.
Like Evola pointed out, that even when these games, or even when the states that they that host the games run out of funds or can't put on the full display of the ritualistic aspect of these games, they're never repressed, but they are merely simplified because they are a necessary component to society. And part of that is, in fact, the outlet in which these warriors and generals can participate in society during peacetime. Because otherwise, you may have discontent and anarchy with these, high-minded, high-spirited, high physicality, virile men that take action against what would otherwise be a corrupt and decadent and failing system. Because, in our contemporary sense, I don't even want to get into that because that's a whole multiplicity of worms and cans to open. But say back in the day in antiquity, it would be, a nation that doesn't have the funds to host its own games might have the, to the lesser extent, the common man questioning why that is in the first place. What hard times did the nation come under that, they can't even put upon the ritual aspect of society. But otherwise, it's also important because it gives an opportunity for men to be on that path that they wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to ascend to. And I think someone who's on an ascetic path in the modern world, found in sports, is someone like Tom Brady or someone like Michael Jordan, where they didn't need to be in their sports, like their respective sports, as long as they did. They had multiple championships, more than most other people in their sport, playing at a professional level, would ever dream of having. I think most people ever playing in a professional sport don't even receive a championship, and they're not even the people who would be attributed with having brought their team to success in the first place. But people like Tom Brady or people like Michael Jordan are so good and so exceptional in their respective fields that they are often given the credit to the overall team's success, as well as their own personal accomplishments with being the champions of their arenas, being the deadliest gladiators of their arenas, thereforth. And it is not for the money, not for the
fame or the glory,
the fame or things, glory to some extent, because that's on a higher spiritual level than just fame itself. But it is for the simple, pure path that they are of that arena. They are in that sort of flow state, that out-of-body experience when they're playing that game, because they're just masters of it. That's their arena, and they do it to do it because that's the action that they're called upon to do. It's not necessarily to entertain anyone or for the masses. They would be doing it with an empty stadium, and still putting their bodies on the line to just be the best that they can be, because that is what they're meant to do in a sense, and they prove it to be so.
In a sense, I feel like that same thing can be attributed to artists like Michael Jackson, who, controversies aside, was this absolute master of the stage, and was very antisocial. I don't want to say antisocial, but you know what I mean. Like in person, was just very not
Socially awkward. Yeah.
socially awkward. Not a performer by any means in in the sphere of sociality. But when it comes to his field, which was performing on stage or making music or singing or whatever, he was exceptional and stayed in the game for up until he died. And there was even when he died, he was going to go on his biggest tour yet, and that was when he was 50. And so he could have retired like all the other people of his age, but he didn't. And he was still out there, producing new albums and drumming up concerts and quite literally, dancing around a stage at 50 years old, when most people wouldn't want to do that after they're 40, and it's
Part of that was controversies with Sony as a company, and if anyone is interested, due to his controversies and due to the things leading up to his death, I highly recommend the 3-part series that Razor Fist does, which is available on BitChute and YouTube. Highly recommend that series, going into who Michael Jackson was, the controversies, and his eventual death. But that's an aside.
interesting. I might take a look at that. But he's just one of those another example of someone who participates in that out of body experience when he is devoted to his activity, to which he has been either predisposed or post-disposed after his birth, because his dad did force him into it. But then even if that were the case and he was disposed into it by his dad, then the situation of his birth, metaphysically speaking, was ordained before he was born. So you know what I mean? It's a constant...
he was meant to be the king of pop.
Exactly. And that essentially he's another one of those representations, like you said, like Michael Jordan, like Tom Brady. There are individuals throughout history who kind of signify this participation, even in the idea of the path of action, and more specifically in the path of games. And the ritual aspect is certainly there. It can be certainly found. And that's why I really like your dismissal of the common cast infatuation with these types of people, because what they are experiencing and what they are doing versus what they are marketed as and who they appeal to are two entirely different things. And it's important to note also that, and I don't think Evola actually considers this fact here, but the common cast outnumbers the regal upper castes like 5-1, at the very least, maybe 10-1.
I'd say a lot more.
Yeah, 100-1 even. And so the people who did attend these games, yeah, sure, there were senators and there were, patricians and all of that, but these games also appealed to the common cast back then. That was one of their main entertainment points. And so even back then, there was a plebeian infatuation with the games, and they didn't understand exactly what it was that a gladiator was experiencing when he got his kill, and while maybe the regal priests or the spiritual bodies that were formed specifically for the games did understand, this was not the orientation of the masses. They just kind of conformed to this event because it intrigued them. They wanted to go and see these gladiators fight.
It's the bread and circuses, as Cicero would say.
Exactly. And so I don't think Evola considers that either, because he mentions that modern games are profane, which they are in a sense compared to the older games. But
I think he does a little bit, but he doesn't expand upon it, because so many people do point to modern games or our contemporary games as bread and circuses, and any civilization teetering on collapse is going to inflate the importance of those games while deteriorating the spiritual ritual involved in them, to simplify them as a distraction for the masses, because there's temporal things that the state or whatever power structure is more worried about that they don't want the masses to see. And that aspect I totally get. I think that's implied with what Evola was writing here, but it is a very common attribution that people throw out, and which is what I wanted to dispel in regard to, like you said, what the athlete themselves is experiencing on the field. And for the common average person who follows sports and follows it almost religiously, it is bread and circuses situation, especially in dying societies like our own, or like the end of Rome, or so on and so forth. That's like anyone can see that. It's very easy to point out and say, but beyond that, before that, there is a whole different aspect to these things. Before there's any fame or money or anything else involved with these sports that get inflated to this circus that it is, there is just the ritual and the adherence to the craft that people get into on a spiritual level that isn't really expressed necessarily. Like we brought up with Christopher Lee, he may not have necessarily been aware that he's on this ascetic path, but his very nature put him on that call to action, and he just did it. And that's the same with people like Michael Jackson or Tom Brady. They were put on their paths and they just did it because they were good at it. Yeah.
And
they were meant to do it.
Sorry for interrupting, but it's that actualization of, quote unquote, God's plan, in a sense. If that is the design that is set out for you, they didn't squander it. They didn't go and become an accountant, and to become a musician, really, and to pursue the arts, or to pursue games, or to pursue anything that isn't guaranteed, like a stockbroker, or a financial advisor, or a orthodontist, or a surgeon, right? All of these are guaranteed paychecks, and you can go to school and you can learn the certain the certain educational parameters that you need to have to participate in the job, and then you can go to work, and there's your guaranteed paycheck, and eventually you will find a job, and that's kind of guaranteed. But to go down the path of an athlete, right, or to go down the path of an actor like Christopher Lee, after a war, no less, and to go down the path of a musician like Michael Jackson, or all of these other great musicians as well, requires a serious, or to go down the path of a writer like Evola, for example, it requires a serious devotion to a craft that may or may not produce a fruitful lifestyle. And so this renunciation of money, and I'm not saying that this renunciation of money comes after they get money. I'm sure that, athletes do become disposed to greed, and so do musicians, and so do writers who become famous. But for the most part, they know that they're not going to become famous. They know that they might not become the next Michael Jackson, the next Tom Brady, the next Julius Evola, right? But they write, or they perform, or they make music, or they play sports in lieu of all that, because they believe it's their calling. They are predisposed to this path. Whether or not that path actually gains them any type of physical saturation is one thing, but the most important thing is that they are able to participate in this type of spirituality through this action. And so even taking that path, going down that route, and saying, I want to become an athlete, and saying, all right, fine, I'm not going to get this job, I'm not going to study for that job, I'm going to make my music, and I'm going to make it, with that confidence, and with that, in a sense, signature look of superiority. You know what I'm going down that path. Going down that path with that just that air of confidence around you. And like that's what signifies this type of participation. And when you actually achieve it, that kind of goes into the next part of what this chapter talks about, which is victory, because it's games and victory, Mm-hmm. And so on the one hand, you have the games, which...
Before you go on any further, though, because there's an important point I wanted to emphasize. Sure. with what you just said, is that you're entirely right that people pursuing these crafts are conscious to the fact that, they very well may not be, and may even assure themselves that they won't be the next Michael Jackson or the next Tom Brady or so forth. But they pursue these goals anyways because they still have this gnawing desire to contribute to whatever art or discipline or culture that exists, this rite, as it were, the RITE, that they're inspired by those greats that came before them. And, contemporarily we see these positions as decadent and borderline aristocratic because of the worship that people give to them in, our celebrity-obsessed culture that we have, because, again, dying society, we get the point on that. It is the fact that we are at that stage that those people are given such prominence within their lifetime in the first place, but we're also focused on the ones that have succeeded because the system selected them or allowed them to succeed, or because they were so exceptional in the first place, there was no option other than their success. But so many of the historic examples that we have of the greats, the great athletes, the great writers, the great musicians and poets and so forth, they often aren't appreciated within their lifetimes anyways. They may make a living off of what they do. They may gain popularity later in life or something to that extent, but many, 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 many of them never see the fruits of their labor within their lifetime, and it's only decades or maybe centuries after their death that they find the impact, or that their works impact society in the way that is deserved.
Vincent van Gogh is a
someone
good
like
example.
Van Gogh, or what's his name, Edgar Allan Poe, or so many other people, die in poverty, die in anguish. They're starving artists in a way, but then that culture that they produce and that influences so many other people after they're gone is the thing that everyone looks at as a staple of our culture and identity in society now. And that's all throughout history and all throughout civilizations that this occurs. And you have to keep that in mind as well, that often, these people were on that path because they knew they were meant to be, and they didn't live to see it, but it became true anyways, and their impact is now appreciated and recognized.
Definitely. And it's like you said, they didn't have any guarantee that they would, like I said, like you said, make it in a sense and achieve that heightened personality status as they existed in the temporal world. They wouldn't be, like you said, the next Michael Jackson, the next any of that. But like you said, they pursued this path with a vigor and an intensity that's rarely ever seen by anyone who pursues any path, let alone these paths that usually become so financially and physically and even emotionally draining. It's very hard for athletes, actors, musicians, artists, anyone to have a significant other or to have a social life, because they're putting all of their being into their craft. And once, but they dedicate themselves to that craft so much because they believe in that craft, and that's how they transcend. Essentially, that's how they participate in that higher experience. That's how they, even if it's not direct asceticism because they are not ascetics themselves, they definitely have attributes of the ascetic archetype imprinted on them, and they use those to manifest these qualities in their craft. And that's definitely the important aspect about these people. And then the ones that do make it achieve that victorious status. They achieve victory. It's not a pipeline in a sense. It's not a craft to victory pipeline or a participation to victory pipeline. But victory signifies this otherworldly. It signifies an overcoming of sorts, an overcoming of a certain obstacle that impedes you from participating in this type of reality through the mode of your craft. So when an athlete wins the championship, or not even wins the championship, but let's say an athlete, is not very good at their sport and they win their first game, that's already a certain type of victory that allows them to overcome this what's it called, the obstacles that are set out for them. And so he says that Evola says in this chapter, he says, in this way, action took place in the context of material symbols representing higher meanings, so that the magical method and technique hidden in the ludi, which always began with solemn sacrifices and were often celebrated to invoke divine powers at times of imminent national danger, could have greater efficacy. And so this victory becomes translated not only through the individual, but into wider society as well. And it's funny because when games are held, typically this is another reason I think that Evola transcribes on modern games the characteristic of being lesser, because the games are not held at a significant time anymore. They are kind of, within the course of the year, but they're not held at significant times in moments that will impact a given event. Whereas in traditional society, they were seen as almost the fortune teller of a given event that was going to happen. So let's say your country was going to go to war, right? You would hold games before the war, and the victory of the athletes would signify the victory that was going to translate from these athletes, who were usually warriors themselves, onto the battlefield. It was going to go with them onto the battlefield. And so that's what these games signify in victory, is that this victorious property would be bestowed upon them by the gods through the games. That would be the vehicle. And then they would go out to war, and Rome, or whoever, would achieve glory through this victorious property that was already with them. It's a sense that the gods are with us. We did this. It's almost like their practice. We practiced, we did all this, now let's go out and do the real thing. Let's go conquer this land for the empire. And as we've already said, the empire is this super spiritual, universalized principle itself. And so he goes, this is why those games that were not performed according to tradition were looked down upon as unorthodox sacred rituals. If their representation were upset by an accident or interrupted for any reason, it was considered an omen of bad luck and a curse, and the games had to be started all over again in order to placate the divine powers. Conversely, according to a famous legend, when the people, following a surprise attack by the enemy, left the games, which were in the meantime not interrupted, in order to take up arms, they found the enemy miraculously routed by a supernatural power that was later on identified with the power evoked by the rite of the games dedicated to the savior Apollo. Which essentially, he's talking about a tradition, or a reenactment of a tradition here. But in a sense, if the games were interrupted by a given war, by a given attack, the games were still used as justified rituals to, in a sense, accompany the peasantry who take up arms and defend the city, or whatever it may be. And so this is why there is such a connection between the games and the warrior aspect, because the games signify almost a war when there is not war. It's an overcoming again of that order and chaos that was noted to be the greater war. So in a sense, you have on the lowest, most material plane, you have games, which is peacetime war. Then you have the lesser holy war, which is wartime war, and then you have the greater holy war, which is the metaphysical war. And so participation in the games allows for better and greater participation in the lesser holy war, which allows for greater and better participation in the greater holy war. Does all that make sense? Do you have anything to add?
I was actually, because that was a good place to get into the ending of the chapter as well, in now this degradation and removal of the spiritual and heroic precepts of these games. But no, that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So, what did you where did you want to start off?
Well, Evola starts with the distinction between the heroic and traditional values underpinning the, I guess, sport and victorious aspects of these traditions, and then goes on to explain further that the asceticism there is a general broaching into our modern age, the removal of the heroic aspect of this path exists entirely within man, because it is not seeking that spiritual center from which it needs to be oriented towards. So even with figures like, the Tom Brady's or the Michael Jordans of the world, if they don't understand that that path that they're on does go beyond, the act of their games or their temporal lives, they'll have wasted the potential of what they've achieved into being completely within themselves and be almost like this spiritual ego death in a sort of way. And it's in part a Nietzschean concept that Evola calls upon, but far later down the line, it's what Theodore Kaczynski then reframes as well, or reiterates, maybe completely unbeknownst, that Evola had written in a similar way on surrogate activities and how the heroic myth on individual, voluntaristic, superhuman attitude contributing into these games being completely absent from the modern man is now a vacuous type of sensory distraction that is an emptiness that distracts him from this development of modernity. And it, like we said, with the plebeian obsession with sports and many other forms of entertainment and celebrity worship and so on, it is like a type of drug that is in constant need of supply for the masses to be fixated upon, so that they aren't looking at the degradation around them. As Evola speaks on the dark age of the Kali Yuga and this restlessness that knows no limitation because of the existential fervor and the source of elation that it all stems from.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that if a person, in a sense, the institution itself should be directed at this spiritual performance, as well as the individuals themselves, and so they need to all be directed with this sort of orientation upwards. And Evola kind of characterizes that here. He says, since I've mentioned action and heroism as traditional values, it is expedient to underline the difference between them and the forms that, a few exceptions notwithstanding, can be seen in our day and age. The difference consists, once again, in the lack of the dimension of transcendence, and thus of an orientation that, even when it is not dictated by pure instinct and blind force, does not lead to a true opening, but rather generates qualities that are destined to bestow on the empirical subject only a dark and tragic splendor. In the case of the ascetical values, we find an analogous alteration that deprives asceticism of every enlightening element as one goes from the notion of asceticism to that of ethics, especially in relation to moral doctrines such as the Kantian and Stoic ethical systems. Every morality is nothing but secularized asceticism. And this is funny that he says this here, because earlier he talks about a deviation from religion, or from morality and propriety, which is why I tend to stay away from using the term morality myself, because morality indicates a given formal system. Morality indicates dogma, whereas propriety indicates an order that is essential and not necessarily a given form. And so it's funny here that he characterizes asceticism as, morality as nothing but secularized asceticism. But it's in a sense true, because once the moral argument comes to the forefront of everything, it's not necessarily a matter of spiritual transcendence, but a matter of conformity to a certain dogma or certain dogmatic approach to operation or behavior. And so that's an interesting characterization. He gets into the Nietzschean principle, like Cody was saying. He says, as is the case with asceticism in general, when heroism and action are not aimed at leading back one's personality to its true center, They are nothing but an artificial device that begins and ends with man. As such, they do not acquire a meaning or a value beyond that of sensation, exaltation, or frantic impulsiveness. And so, I think what he's doing here is sort of characterizing, or I guess relating, the earlier type of game participant to the earlier type of warrior, and then the modern game participant to the modern type of soldier, which if we can make the distinction in difference in qualities, then yes, in a sense that the modern one is more subdued. But like we were talked about earlier, I think it might be a bit of a impulsive conclusion to jump to, because relatively, when you're considering one period of time, they are kind of the same.
I think that the potential is still there for any individual to find their ascetic path within these institutions or within these pursuits, but as the general consensus go, most of them participating even in the highest levels of, soldiering or in athletics or in art, as it were, if you air quote art, are lost within the modernity that exists now, and so their motivations and their goals are completely temporal and completely within themselves, as Evola stated there, and that's why they fail in any ascetic path, because it's an artificial construction of the modern age, and very, very few people can actually say that they're on, if they're even aware of it, any path of action that's divine in nature.
Yeah, definitely. And he goes on to talk again, like you said, about the about how modern man does need these type of distractions, or surrogate activities is a good way to characterize them also, but these types of in a sense, I guess distractions to kind of like a drug, to satiate him, to keep him unaware and conforming, subdued, exactly. Conforming to the general dogma, which is the essential characteristic of the common caste, and that would be true. That was true 1,000 years ago, and that will be true 4,000 years in the future. Now, on the last,
because without these outlets to satiate that restlessness of the masses, like I mentioned, in antiquity or in today, there would be chaos or revolutions or whatever have you, even just out of boredom, because, like I said, there is an aberration of idleness that must be rejected or overcome, because it is held with such disdain, even implicitly in the minds of man, that if there's not something there to do in any sense, then we'll just create chaos in order to overcome it with later order. It's a very strange aspect of ourselves, which Evola does touch upon here, but someone like Kaczynski goes in even deeper detail about, which I highly recommend to read his Industrial Society and its future, in addition to these chapters here, because it will really help you understand the wider picture of modernity in this sense that Evola didn't even live to see in many respects, because of how it devolved even further past his lifetime and past his writing of this book.
Yeah, Kaczynski really gets at the psychology of the modern orientation of man, and Evola really gets at the metaphysics of it, and that's these two are very informative when you want to come to a holistic conclusion, I think, about what the issue actually is here, and why the necessity for these traditional institutions is always omnipresent. You know what I mean? And so he goes on to say here. Let's see. I just had it. Maybe it wasn't on this page. I see. Conversely, the proud self-assurance with which traditional man reacted valiantly and superindividually against the unrighteous, armed with faith and the sword, and the spiritual impassibility that placed him in an a priori absolute relation to a supernatural power, not subject to the power of the elements, sensations, and natural laws, all these things have come to be considered mere superstitions. In this context, too, the decline of traditional values, and when he says traditional values, he doesn't necessarily mean with the rhetorical conservative emphasis on, quote-unquote traditional values or conservative values. He's actually talking about capital T, perennialist traditional society values. In this context, too, the decline of traditional values has been followed by their inversion, an inversion that can be seen at work wherever the modern world makes a profession of realism and seems to take up the idea of an identity of victory and law with the principle of might is right. And we touched upon this in our podcast, too, about the idea of might is right. But in a sense, this touches upon the divide between physicality and metaphysicality, whereas someone may have the metaphysical right to a position, but if someone has physically overtaken that position, they have the physical right to it. So now ownership and proper right is divided into two, and those with the physical disposition will say that the stronger equals the more correct or the more proper, whereas it is sort of the inverse. It is the more proper is the more proper, and the stronger is the stronger. And in a sense, that it is kind of a juxtaposition or a contradiction, but Evola hits the nail on the head right here. He says, since this is might in the highest material sense of the word, or better, if we refer to war in its most recent forms in an almost demonic sense, since the technical and industrial potential has become the most decisive factor, then we can see that discussions about values and righteousness are merely rhetorical, which is what I was saying earlier. Such rhetoric is employed through big words and a hypocritical declamation of principles as a means in the service of an ugly will to power. This is a particular upheaval characterizing the last times, more on which later. So that's how he ends out the chapter, and those are essentially the three chapters that we were talking about today, which, as you can see, they are very dense. They are not long chapters. They are, let's see, in all we read from
was it what 22 pages altogether?
It was 31 pages. We read from page 111 to 142. But this, they were very dense in characterizing the nature of the path of asceticism, because this is one thing that he hasn't touched upon just yet, which is someone who is outside the caste. The whole book was building up the traditional society. The whole book was pretty much building up the right-hand path. And then on this one, he details the left-hand path, in a sense, which is why these chapters are so dense right at the end of the first part of the book. I heard you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, like I said, the chapter 16 was probably the most dense, where he said the most with the least amount of words, because that was only 5 pages. And we have, 31?
Yeah, 31.
Pages that we went over, which, 16 pages per chapter is relatively decent size. That's about the average that we've been through so far. But only 5 pages through the concepts that we went over for an hour just in chapter 16 to set up for the ascetic path of action here was, I'd say, much, much more dense than what we went over in here. And a lot of the time was, us putting in our own examples to further drive home the points that Evola was stating. He could have made these chapters even shorter and still, had the points there, but I think the most critical portions were the introductions and ends. I'd say the first two
or so pages.
Yeah, the first 2 or 3. Yeah, the first 2 or so pages and the last 2 or so pages of each chapter, and that's those are the hearts of it, and everything else is kind of Evola nerding out or flexing his
esoteric real knowledge.
his knowledge of history and antiquity.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way Evola writes, and I do like that, because he starts out, he says his point in the most essential manner that he can. Then he will detail all of the ways in which this essential point manifests, And then he will close out by saying, if these essential points are not met, society decays in such and such a factor, or in such and such a manner. And that's kind of how he went about the whole book. And these last three chapters are exemplary of that, most definitely. But I think these were very important chapters. And the next 3 chapters that we're going to be dealing with are Space, Time, the Earth. Let's see. Man and Woman. And the Decline of Superior Races, which these are the last chapters in part 1 of this book, which will lead on then to part 2, which is more of a historiography of tradition, like I said. And part 2 is where it gets, I don't want to say it's where it gets interesting, but I really like part 2. Part 2 is very nice. If you read part 2 along with looking at images of Hyperborea and, mythological, interpretations, artwork, things like that, part 2 will give you a very nice feeling. It's a great part to go into with Christmas time as well. That's when I first read it, so maybe I'm biased, but anyways,
maybe getting really into the immersion of it all
exactly
is the best way to do it.
Exactly. I'll send you artwork. Anyways, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we close off?
No, that about covers it. I guess it's time to wrap up and close out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I would like to thank everybody for listening into today's podcast. This was a rather long one for 3 chapters, but we did it, and I think it was necessary. We detailed all of the correct things that needed to be said, and went over all of the plot points of the chapters at hand. And so, like I said, next time we'll be dealing with the last 3 chapters in this book, and that'll be it for part 1 of Revolt Against the Modern World. I haven't really seen anyone else do these kinds of analyses, like chapter by chapter on this book, except for maybe 1 or 2 on YouTube. So,
Philosophica is the only one I can think of.
Yeah,
and
me
she
too.
almost does readings of the chapters herself. But even then, very high quality work. I praise her for what she does. Although it is very long and spacious in between when she drops episodes, so there's the issue with that as well. Although I guess
I was gonna say, can we talk?
we're not much better. We're not much better.
Can we really speak? Do we have any ground to stand on? But anyways, yes. Thank you for listening into today's podcast. I hope to see you next time. Thank you once again, Cody.
As always, and everyone be sure to check out the links down below and check out any of the suggestions we made in readings or videos otherwise. Follow us on all our social medias, and hope to see you next time.
Most definitely. My name is Vincent, and hope to see you next time at the Praxis Table Talks.